Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've had some time to recover from the last lecture. I told you this was going to be a heavy week. It's not always easy taking a walk on the dark side, but it is important. Now that you are familiar with some key psychological experiments illustrating how we are capable of inflicting significant harm on each other, let's apply that theoretical knowledge to the field of workplace bullying, also referred to as workplace mobbing. This lecture will introduce the concept of bullying and mobbing, and I'll show how social identity theory and evolutionary psychology can explain mobbing behavior at work. Once again, I emphasize that even though we can explain workplace mobbing through the lenses of social psychology, this does not mean that we can justify it. These are two separate issues entirely. In my mind, workplace mobbing is never justifiable. So, workplace mobbing refers to the systematic bullying and harassment of an employee with the objective of forcing him or her out of the organization. This is an extremely common phenomenon, particularly in the public sector and in unionized environments. A triggering event sets off a workplace mob that relentlessly bullies a targeted victim and forces that person out of the workplace. In light of Milgram and Zimbardo's experiments, you should not be surprised to learn that humans engage in this kind of behavior. But human beings aren't the only species on Earth to demonstrate a propensity to mob or bully. The animal kingdom is full of examples of various species that mob as a defensive mechanism against predators. Thus, in order to understand this social behavior, we must first turn to the study of animal behavior, also referred to as ethology or behavioral ecology. Biologists and zoologists think of mobbing as an innate behavior that enables survival in a competitive and dangerous environment. When a group of animals is threatened by a predator, they often naturally mob the threat to life in the hopes that collective action will be enough to ensure their survival. Many examples of this are evident in the animal kingdom. Birds are often the most effective mobbers, but this behavior has also been observed across multiple species, including, for example, meerkats and even a group of seals who collectively mobbed a great white shark, believe it or not. Evolutionary theorists argue that this is a natural response to a threat to survival. In a kill or be killed situation, the group turns on the individual and simply does not stop until the perceived threat is dead. Sadly, human beings are similar, except instead of killing the target, we often psychologically destroy the target instead. Now, I'm going to show you some footage of an example of animal mobbing. This clip is 5 minutes long and it is extremely hard to watch. It shows a murder of crows turning on a member of the group and attacking it until it's dead. It's ironic that a group of crows is referred to as a murder, isn't it? I personally don't like watching this clip. It's disturbing and hard to view. So if you feel like you can't handle it, then you're welcome to skip forward by 5 minutes if this is something you feel is too hard to watch. But the reason I'm showing it to you is that it really demonstrates the biological origins of workplace mobbing behaviors. In the same way that this group of crows turns against one of their own, we also can turn against one of our own. and do tremendous damage to the target. This video is a metaphor for our own behaviors. When most people think of bullying, they don't automatically think of it taking place at work. For most of us, bullying is something that happens at school. Research has shown that bullying starts at a young age and is rather prevalent. The highest prevalence of bullying among school aged children is from around 10 to 11 years old. But bullying at school looks a little different from bullying at work. School bullying typically involves physical aggression, whereas workplace bullying does not. Both types of bullying involve social exclusion, teasing, and the spreading of lies and rumors. A disturbing trend over the last few years are the rising cases of cyberbullying at school. This wasn't an issue when I was a young boy, but it is for today's youth. Cyberbullying usually takes place over social media and can involve the sending of aggressive messages or threats, the spreading of false rumors, or sending unflattering or sexually explicit content to peers, for example. Now, firm statistics on the prevalence of bullying are hard to come by, especially because there are various definitions of what constitutes bullying, but scholars have estimated variously that 1 in 3, maybe 1 in 4, or maybe 1 in 7 children in Australia are bullied at school or online. We're growing, I think, sadly accustomed to news of young children committing suicide as a result of bullying at school, as illustrated in this clip.
It's been nearly 4 months since Cornelia Reynolds discovered the unthinkable. Her 8-year-old son dead in his bedroom. Gabriel had hanged himself from his bunk bed.
He probably didn't want to say, Mom, somebody bullying or picking on me, you know. He just didn't know how to tell me.
Reynolds spoke with our Cincinnati affiliate, WLWT, days after Gabriel's death and says she was never told her third grader was being bullied. But tonight, this video has been released showing an alleged assault in a school bathroom where Gabriel is knocked unconscious 2 days before he ended his life.
The school district never told Mom that there was a video. They never told Mom that he had been assaulted.
Family attorneys were given the video after they began asking questions. The school district denies any wrongdoing, saying in part, though the connection between this incident at school and Gabriel's suicide are not clear, the district shared this video with police investigators at the time of the incident. Their investigation has concluded and no charges were filed. They say a school nurse checked Gabriel's vitals at the time, which were normal, and called his mom. She says she was only told her son had fainted.
They busted my baby's lip. They busted his nose. And Gaby, I'm sorry.
This new video is prompting the coroner to reopen the death investigation as Gabriel's mother wonders what could have been done if she had only known.
Of course, bullying behavior is not confined to the playground. It happens in workplaces as well, perhaps more frequently than we'd like to realize. Curiously, as I mentioned before, it is more common in the public sector than in the private sector. It is also more common in unionized organizations than in non-unionized organizations. Moreover, you're much more likely to see workplace bullying in places like Scandinavia than in the United States. The reasons for this are multifaceted, but ultimately I think it comes down to how difficult it is to terminate one's employment. When termination of employment is easy, like in the United States, or in the private sector, or in non-unionized firms, bullying is much less frequent because organizations can just fire people at will. There is no need to force people out through management-style bullying. But in the public sector and in highly unionized industries, it's very hard to fire people. In such organizations, bullying is one of the most effective ways to force employees out of the firm. This is often referred to as constructive dismissal. Technically, the employee resigns, but in reality, he or she is forced out. For this reason, such bullying is often implicitly and sometimes explicitly condoned by management. The bullying process typically begins with a minor conflict or a triggering incident that spirals out of control. An employee might make a complaint or file a grievance with the result that he or she is viciously expelled for having done so. As I noted, whereas playground bullying often involves physical violence, this is much less common among adults. Physical violence is, of course, illegal, and so the perpetrator could end up in prison. Psychological violence, on the other hand, is much more difficult to detect, but just as damaging, if not more so. So, what is workplace mobbing? It can be defined as a form of psychological terrorism inflicted on a target by a group. Typically, though not always, the target is a single employee. Anyone who stands up against the mob to defend the target essentially becomes a target themselves. Mobbing activities are typically long-term and relentless. Once an individual has been targeted for exclusion from the workplace, the psychological assault is vicious and unyielding. It does not stop until the target leaves the workplace, usually through resignation. The aim of the mob is to force the target out by inflicting severe psychological damage. We don't know the true prevalence of workplace mobbing behaviors, primarily because when this does happen, the victim often signs a settlement agreement with the employer, and most such agreements contain a confidentiality clause that prohibits victims from talking about it. Mobbing behavior has been shown to be absolutely devastating to the target's health, both psychological and physiological. Many victims are so damaged by the experience that they are unable to re-enter the labor market after being expelled. They often suffer from paranoia and long-term trust problems and become obsessed with the miscarriage of justice that they experience. This is a common list of workplace mobbing activities and behaviors. It isn't a comprehensive list, but for those who have been mobbed out of the workplace, many subjects report experiencing these behaviors throughout the process. One of the first things that mobbing targets realize is that they are being socially excluded, ostracized, and silenced. They may no longer be invited out to lunch or to drinks after work. They may no longer be invited to meetings, or they find that meeting times and locations have mysteriously changed without them being advised. When they walk around the office, they're met with silence from their colleagues. Targets may be threatened with termination of employment. This is the key leverage that employers have over employees. In mobbing situations, the employer intentionally creates an intolerable atmosphere of job insecurity so as to force the target out. Targets may be ridiculed on the basis of various personal characteristics, from race and gender through to sexual orientation, religion, disability, or physical appearance, among other traits. Another common tactic that mobbers use is to spread lies about the victim in an effort to tarnish his or her reputation among colleagues. Similarly, employers may outright fabricate evidence against the target to use in disciplinary hearings. When evidence of misconduct is fabricated, the target realizes that he or she then has no choice but to leave. To stay would be untenable under such circumstances. Another aspect of mobbing is that the employer proactively looks for the smallest work-related mistakes to use against the target. The target's work is also commonly sabotaged by the mobbers, making the victim look incompetent and thus subject to capability procedures. Another aspect of mobbing is that the target is reassigned duties that are extremely mundane or dangerous. Very rarely, a target is threatened physically or sexually. As these are criminal offenses, such actions are very uncommon. The aim of mobbing is essentially to create an environment that is hostile and intolerable so that the target resigns because this is the easier option than termination of employment. Let's talk about what the mobbing process looks like from start to finish. Across organizations, the process is remarkably similar. It usually begins with a critical incident or triggering situation. This could be a minor conflict among coworkers or with a manager. Other times, the employee discovers wrongdoing on the part of workers or managers. From that point on, an interpersonal conflict, usually between two people, spreads. The more powerful actor, usually the manager, mobilizes other coworkers and colleagues to join in on the mob. Sometimes bystanders begin to actively bully the target. Other times they passively watch the bullying and do nothing to defend the victim. As I noted before, rarely do bystanders speak up in support of the victim because if they do, then they become targets themselves. The conflict then escalates, usually when the target files a formal grievance or reports wrongdoing to higher level authorities. Human resources may get involved at this point, and an investigation usually ensues. The outcome of the investigation is oftentimes a foregone conclusion, regardless of the facts, because it typically concludes that the target is, of course, at fault. The facts that the organization present to the investigation, as noted previously, are often fabricated. At the end of the process, the target almost inevitably is expelled or leaves the workplace. He or she commonly becomes paranoid, depressed, anxious, and suicidal as a result of the actions of the mob. It should not be surprising to learn that the effects of mobbing on the target are catastrophic. It has been reported that victims of mobbing suffer from both psychological and physiological pathologies. On the psychological side, common effects include depression, anxiety, paranoia, and post-traumatic stress disorder. On the physiological side, common effects include high blood pressure, stroke, and cardiovascular disease. Insomnia usually accompanies workplace mobbing. Beyond these individual effects, there are also other spillovers. The target's family frequently suffers. Children hardly recognize their targeted parents. Marriages often end in divorce as a result of the strain that it places on the relationship. Another obvious effect is a financial one. The target is overwhelmingly expelled from work at the end of the process, resulting in a sudden loss of income at a vulnerable time. There are organizational costs too. Firms and organizations pay huge sums of money on sick leave, settlement agreements, and through legal representation in employment tribunals. There are significant government costs as well. These come in the form of incapacity and disability benefits resulting from the ill health effects discussed on the previous slide. Organizations that regularly participate in workplace mobs to expel workers also frequently suffer from extremely low levels of morale. Employees start to fear that they might be next in line for expulsion. The anti-bullying and harassment policies that the organization pretends to have in place are rendered useless. Finally, mobbing can result in a significant loss in productivity, not just for the victim, but also for other bystanders watching it all happen. There is no shortage of costs for organizations, individuals, families, and societies, so why do we do it? How can we explain the prevalence of mobbing behaviors? To answer these questions, we have to return once again to social identity theory. Social identity theory explains much of our behavior, including our deepest, darkest behaviors. All of the key elements of social identity theory can be found in workplace mobbing. The workplace is a social group, an in-group, if you will. Within the workplace, we're all members of the same team, the same organization. We share the same organizational identity. But when a mobbing target is identified, he or she is violently thrust out of the in-group and into the out-group. The in-group becomes even more coherent and resolved to expel the target, and differences between the group and the target are accentuated and exaggerated. A key element of social identity theory is devaluation and dehumanization of the outgroup. This is exactly what happens in cases of workplace mobbing. The mob has to find some way to rationalize their treatment of this individual, so they convince themselves that the target is just a bad person, someone who is less than human. Former friends and coworkers suddenly join the mob against the target. The perpetrators convince themselves that their behavior is just and right because the victim deserves to be expelled because of the threat that they pose to the in-group. Indeed, across history, genocide has been justified and rationalized for the exact same reason. Most perpetrators don't even recognize their behavior as mobbing. They see it as a heroic act of expelling an existential threat from the group. If you want to know how and why we can be so cruel to each other, how we can mimic the behavior of a murder of crows as they mercilessly eviscerate one of their own, all you have to do is to read an introduction to social psychology textbook. Deep down, we are all animals.